As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
I think, once again, our guest might top the best Twitter handle name. Afro Materialism. Welcome to the Malcolm Effect, Aaron. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for joining me. First things first, before we get into like the nitty gritty, the more serious things, tell me the story behind your Twitter handle.
Yeah, so I guess I was just kind of trying to think of a Twitter handle for the longest time, and I had this one friend on Twitter who had a really impressive Twitter handle, and their Twitter handle was queer socialism, and so I was thinking, right, I was like, oh, okay, what are some of the things that I think like sort of best relate to who I am and who can, or rather, what
Mm-hmm.
can really capture my politics? And so it's sort of as a result of myself being someone who believes very firmly in African liberation and also someone who upholds like a materialist analysis that I really settled on the handle Afro Materialism.
Thank you. Thanks for telling us and the listeners. Okay, so I think we're going to have a great conversation given the things that you like to ground yourselves in terms of politics. I think we're on the same wavelength. I love your tweets, especially your stuff about dialectics. So thank you. I learn a lot. First things first, then. When you say like a materialist politic, what does that mean to you? Or
Yeah.
explain to us, what is a materialist politic?
No, yeah. So that's a really good question. So I guess the best way to really understand what I mean by materialism is to really first sort of outline the difference between materialism and idealism. So
Mm-hmm.
materialism and idealism are very philosophical concepts, and that they are concerned with answering this question, right, of what is sort of the essence of the world and to what extent can we really understand the world as it really is. And
Mm-hmm.
idealism is a philosophical approach that proceeds from the assumption that it is the spiritual that is sort of like the foundation for the world. And materialism really pushes back against that and argues that the spiritual is a product of the material. And so, what I mean by that is essentially materialism is, again, a philosophical doctrine that argues that matter, so like the material world, is something that objectively exists, regardless of whether or not we happen to be perceiving it. And the way I really understand materialism as a sort of grounding focal point for my politics is primarily because the distinction between the philosophical and the political seems unnecessary, in my opinion. Because if
Okay.
we do have correct political ideas, right, it should make sense that these correct political ideas are scientific. And so they need to be able to scientifically evaluate the world, and they need to be able to adequately understand like what it is that really drives the world and what really pushes change. And so materialism, again, is a very important outlook to incorporate into our politics because we can't really change the world without first understanding how the world really is, which sort of goes back to the whole Karl Marx quote, right, where he argues that the point philosophy, is really to change the world, not just to interpret the world. And so that is really how I understand like a materialist approach philosophically and why I try to incorporate it into my politics.
Thank you so much for that beautiful and elaborate explanation. That was dope. And I think essentially what we're saying is we're trying to answer the question, what are the driving forces that push history forward? The
Mhm.
unfolding of history takes place on what register, essentially. And obviously, we're going to have those who believe it's to be spiritual realm, if you're from a religious background. And obviously, all hail King Marx for the tools of dialectical materialism, which teaches us that no, it is the material reality that is primary. However, there is a back and forth, there is a synergy, there is an influencing of both the material that produces what we call the ideological, which that then reinforces or influences once again the material. And I think it's important. And we're talking about
Mhm.
dialectics then. Yeah. So essentially, then, I mean, my next question again would be, if that's materialist politics, why have you adopted that when it comes to black liberation or thinking about black people or thinking about black people transnationally defined? Why is it important in your opinion?
Yeah. So again, I would sort of go back to the idea that in order to change the world, we really need to make sure that we have a correct understanding of the world. And so, as a Black person, right, like I care very deeply about Black liberation. I care very deeply about African liberation. And when I look at the current state of the world, I'm sort of unable to really adequately understand things without first taking notice of the fact that the oppression and exploitation of Black people is sort of a feature of our contemporary society. And so the reason that I believe materialism really helps us to understand the nuances of like Black liberation and African liberation is again coming back to this idea that materialism is a correct philosophical doctrine that allows us to adequately understand the world. And specifically, right, like when we take a materialist analysis and when we apply it to issues of anti Blackness and issues of neocolonialism and imperialism, we are able to really understand what the oppression and exploitation of Black people means. And
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, right, like through a materialist analysis, we should be able to correctly identify the features that enable the oppression and exploitation of Black people, both here in the United States, obviously, of course, and around the world, but also make sure that we can end it. And usually I like to remind people of this one quote by Mandela where he's talking about dialectical materialism and he explains, right, like through dialectical materialism, he sees this sort of searchlight that's really able to illuminate the dark night of racial oppression. And that's something that I also
Mm-hmm.
believe very, very firmly in.
So then my question to you then, and I know people often ask me this question, and I know I also wrestled with it as well, so I'd love to get your thoughts. Are you of the opinion or do you believe that once we merely shift the material conditions or correct them in a way by reorganizing and restructuring production, that racism would go away and there'll be no more
No,
anti-blackness?
no, absolutely not. And I think we should probably revisit your point about dialectics, right? Because we have to make sure that we're, not just committing ourselves to a materialist analysis. We really need to make sure that we're incorporating a dialectical method in our materialism. And by that, I just mean like a way of thinking that really recognizes that all things are sort of interconnected with one another and that there are these
Mm-hmm.
underlying contradictions that we really need to work through if we're going to see any type of like change occur. So, regarding the question of whether or not, like, with the elimination of class society comes the elimination of racism, again, it's really important to understand that racism is a multifaceted phenomenon. And obviously,
Mm-hmm.
right, like when we look to how production is organized and when we look at the political economy of most countries, right, we can see that Black people are super exploited in that they
Mm-hmm.
are having to work some of the hardest jobs and receiving some of the lowest wages as a result of that. But there's also a sort of superstructural component to Black oppression and racism. And obviously, right, like
Yes.
as materialists, we understand that the spiritual or the ideological is a reflection of the material, but that doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
sort of only by changing the material do we change the ideological superstructure, because again, these things share a dialectical relationship with one another, wherein they are constantly reinforcing one another. And so, in the same way, right, that we have to strive to abolish Black oppression in a material sense, we also need to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of the sort of cultural struggle that will sort of
Mm-hmm.
entail a socialist revolution. And this isn't some entirely unfounded idea. Like Lenin was very clear when talking about the creation of a socialist society, that we aren't just stopping upon having reorganized production. The fight for socialism is also one that entails a restructuring of the superstructure of society. And that means changing
Hmm.
culture and recognizing that when we're building a socialist society, there are going to be these ideological remnants of from the capitalist society that preceded it that we're going to have to work to
All
abolish,
hail
and
the
that's going to
Cultural
be a struggle.
Revolution.
I mean, when we look at Lenin's writings, right, he's very clear that building socialism is definitely going to be this two-stage process, and it's going to occur, like, obviously, like, economically, but also culturally. So I definitely
Yeah.
look to Lenin's writings on the question of what it means to create like a society governed by proletarian values and a proletarian culture.
Yeah. Nah, you're spitting. You're spitting. And so much of what you said has echoed my journey towards the doors, the blessed doors of dialectical materialism. Because I think when you live in the realm of, not live, or you are involved in conversations about the metaphysical, and as interesting as they may sound, and even you might even be convinced by the argumentation, I often find myself thinking, but how can we prove this?
Mhm,
Do you know what I mean? Oftentimes thinking, okay, fine, I agree that it is a metaphysical. I mean, I'm someone of faith as well,
mhm,
but I make it very clear my faith is for me personally as an individual, and I think people are moved to action by faith, and we can talk about that further. However, I do think in
mhm.
terms of politics, as I say, niggas are dying every day, man. Like people are dying every day
Yes.
on the street. People are not, people are hungry. People are not eating. So we can pontificate all we want about the metaphysical underpinning of such and such is a slave ontologically. No shade, no tea, no tea,
Yeah,
no shade.
exactly.
Um, but but let's get down to how we're changing people's position, how we're trying to put food on people's tables, and how we're trying to wake people up to understand that there's a better way of restructuring society. So yeah, I fully hear that.
Mhm.
But in terms of like Pan-Africanism, then, what do you find value in Pan-Africanism then? Because I know, unfortunately, I mean, every group has reactionaries, every group has its, I don't want to say sellouts, because I don't even think people are sellouts. People just act according to their class interests. But my
Mhm.
question to you as, I don't want to assume, are you like born, raised in America generationally? Did you migrate to America, to
No,
USA?
yeah, so I was born and raised in America. So I am not necessarily someone that has a, well, I don't want to say like a intimate connection, because obviously like my relationship is very genuine in that I care
Yeah.
about the exploitation and oppression that's happening on the continent, but it's not a immediate reality for me, I guess is the best way I
Hmm.
should phrase that.
The reason I asked then is why did you arrive at Pan Africanism then? Because we have, unfortunately, the reactionaries, the ADOS, the FBA, the people who are, we are the original people of the land, all that stuff. So what is it? Why did you then arrive to like Pan Africanism, thinking about the continent?
I mean, I really arrived at it as a result of myself just coming more towards a Marxist analysis of things and,
Hmm.
just reading a lot of like Black Marxists in particular who were very clear in recognizing that there is no contradiction between being a Marxist, being someone who upholds the necessity of oppressed people aligning themselves with the working class, and being a Pan-Africanist. Like, for instance, like
Hmm.
my probably most foundational Pan-Africanist leader, I guess I should say, probably be Du Bois. And Du Bois was also someone who was
Hmm.
very clear in recognizing, right, that there isn't any antagonistic contradiction between being someone who is a Pan-Africanist, i.e., someone that believes in the liberation of the African continent, imperialism and neocolonialism, and also being a Marxist, being someone who upholds the October Revolution, which Du Bois very much so did. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
But not. But my question would be then, and this is something I don't know, maybe because I'm a black Brit, but not just being a black Brit, I'm also, someone who was born on the continent and then moved to the UK. So it has a different dynamic as well.
Hmm.
But, and I often get involved in conversations with my African American brothers. I call them my African brothers who are in America, who are in the United States of America. And we speak back and forth. And there is definitely sometimes a specificity that they highlight, as in, the patterns of maybe oppression that they might experience might be different to what, say, let's say an immigrant from the continent who freshly arrives on the United States in the United States may experience. So, for example, and I'm not sure how I don't know, I haven't got the numbers to hand now. I know in the UK, for example, we have Caribbean immigration and we have African immigration later on. But again, once you get second, third generation into it, you find that those differences collapse. Those stark differences that maybe we find that, oh, this group of people, black people, are doing better. By third, second generation in, the stats are basically the same, almost identical. But I do want to ask, do you think there is a need to highlight a specificity when it comes to the oppression faced, or is it just boils down to, let's say, a class analysis, say, once again?
So I definitely don't want to say it all boils down to class analysis because oftentimes people will misinterpret statements like that and go on to argue, right, that we completely disregard all of the other modalities of oppression that exist within a class society, which just simply isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important for us to recognize that to recognize the unique oppression that African people experience within a capitalist society. As again, going back to my earlier statement, wherein I explained African people and Black people, like African Americans, of course, experience a type of super exploitation, wherein
Mm-hmm.
again, they have to work some of the worst jobs in industries. They receive some
Yeah.
of the lowest wages, and they experience all other types of inequalities, that are obviously socioeconomic in nature, right? But then you also
Yeah.
have things like police brutality that factor into it. And so it's definitely very important for us to recognize the unique oppressions that people experience if we're going to really incorporate them into our political project. But our ultimate goal has to be making sure that we're building relationships of solidarity between oppressed people and not trying
Yes.
to isolate ourselves, because we need to keep in mind, right? And this goes back to incorporating that dialectical materialist analysis of what is the principal contradiction that we're all facing as oppressed people, as
Yes.
working class people. And that contradiction is it's capitalism, it's the imperialist system. And the only way that we're going to be able to really challenge that principal contradiction is if masses of oppressed and working people come together and recognize that as their enemy.
Exactly, exactly. Nah, so eloquently put and so eloquently put and so like succinct. So thank you very much for that. So moving on then, let's talk about cultural nationalism.
Okay.
Let's unpack it and untangle. Why isn't the cultural nationalist? As I say that very ironically, I hope people can say my question is very ironically asked. When we're talking about cultural nationalism, more specifically Black cultural nationalism, simple question, Aaron. Why isn't it it?
I would probably say it isn't it because it doesn't incorporate a materialist analysis, right? Like it has this very incorrect or sometimes just plainly inadequate understanding of the world. And so, as a result of that, it comes to these very confused political positions that have no basis in material reality. For instance, most notably, right, in the fact that a lot of these cultural nationalists don't really concern themselves with the question of class. And so,
Yep.
as a result of that, they try to act as if Black proletarians have the same interest as the Black bourgeoisie, which again, there just isn't any real evidence to support the idea that we have the same material interest at mind. And that is really, really problematic for the cultural analysis. And that's really problematic for Marxists who espouse like a materialist analysis. So, yeah.
I do ask that though. This is something I've also contended with in my own kind of, I guess, journey. As important as I recognize the primacy of materialist politics, is there room and should there be room for like race pride then? And should that be promoted as well? What do you think? Like, celebration of culture, celebration of certain things as black people that are culture. Again, I can recognize that that's not a politic. No one's saying that. I don't know where it was, but we're not going to flip in twerk for liberation, or we're not going to, all these things that happen that people think is a politics of a liberatory politic. But what do you think? Is there room? Is there not a room for like empowerment in that kind of sense, or making people proud of where they came from and things like that?
Oh, yeah. So, on that question, I would probably have to refer to one of my favorite Black Marxists, Miss Claudia Jones, who has this really excellent quote on the subject wherein she explains that a people's art is the genesis of their freedom. And so I think that there definitely needs to be room for celebration of culture, for the incorporation of art in our movement, because as we all understand class to be the principal contradiction at hand, we have to understand that everything can't be struggle, struggle, struggle all the time. That's not how we build a mass
Hmm.
movement. That's not how we make people feel included in the movements that we're trying to build. We have to recognize that in our society, right? Like, obviously, people are going to be oppressed as proletarians, but they're also going to experience oppression again in these very unique ways. And so, our task is really going to have to be about recognizing those unique ways and making sure that people feel included and sometimes celebrated.
Hmm.
In my own organizing experience, like, we have like a cultural committee for a popular political education organization that I'm a part of, and people on the cultural committee are probably some of the most powerful tools that we have in bringing together a lots of different nationally oppressed people and making
Hmm.
sure that they feel empowered and recognized. So I definitely think there's always going to be space for empowerment in our movements, but we have to make sure that we don't conflate separatism or the cultural nationalists with empowerment, because at the end of the day, the only people that the cultural nationalists are trying to empower, right, is the black bourgeoisie. They're not trying to empower working class black people, which again is kind of
Absolutely.
our goal as black Marxists.
Absolutely. So the knowing that the primary antagonism is one of class antagonisms, even amongst black people. Just a personal question: how do you feel then when you see acts of like racism experienced by the black bourgeoisie?
I mean, personally, I really don't care, because the way in which they do it, I mean, it sounds very crude, but the way in which the black bourgeoisie experiences racism is in no way on the same level as sort of what is experienced by black proletarians. And so whenever someone seriously asks me that question, I kind of get a little insulted, because, it's not necessarily, in my opinion, a form of racial oppression for some member of some board to make some racially insensitive comment towards some black CEO. Like, I honestly, I could not care about that at all. But what I do care about, right, is the fact that the police in this country, who function as an arm of the bourgeois state, have the ability to kill and lynch working class black people with virtually no consequence. And so I think
Yeah,
we really do need to make sure that we're understanding that class antagonism is primary, because that really helps us to understand the difference, the different oppressions that are experienced by black proletarians and the black bourgeoisie, because they're just not on the same level.
absolutely. We're speaking about culture and cultural nationalism. I'm gonna speak about your tweet today on, and I think it was referring to Cedric Robinson.
It was.
I say think, but I know I'm just I'm just going to introduce topic like this. But okay, speaking on Cedric Robinson specifically, I know his work does speak about the revolutionary kind of inherent revolutionary nature of the African.
Mhm.
And I know, and we know online, we go back and forth on this topic all the time. Do you want to expand a bit more about what was the kind of impetus between posting that and your subsequent comments?
No, yeah, of course. So again, as someone who considers themselves to be a materialist, I'm a little hostile towards ideologies that are ultimately idealist in nature. And I'm specifically a little hostile towards a lot of the arguments that are made by Cedric Robinson, particularly in his work, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, because throughout the book, Robinson engages in what I would call a type of epistemological idealism, in that he argues that the radicalism of Black people is rooted fundamentally in what he terms the Africanity of our consciousness. And
Hmm.
this is a little problematic to me as a materialist, because we are not engaging right with what are the material conditions that are sort of the response to, well, the results of black radicalism. we are substituting that materialism for a kind of idealism wherein we argue that is the innate consciousness of Black people that is the root of their radicalism, which is, again, just very incorrect, right? Enslaved Africans had a material interest in overthrowing the slave mode of production. Similarly,
Hmm.
Black proletarians in this country have a material interest in overthrowing the capitalist imperialist system. Our radicalism isn't the natural, or I should say, innate epistemological practice. Like, it's born out of these material processes, these material
Hmm.
instances of oppression that Robinson and other people within his particular school of thought don't ever really wrestle with.
No, I hear that. I hear that, and I think for the most part, I agree. Actually, for the most part, I do agree. It's like I was thinking. I saw this chart, and it mentioned like on the right, it had, and it's not right wing, but just the right of this chart. It
Mhm.
had like those who have a pure metaphysical understanding of race. The middle was those who have it in between. The left was purely those who have a materialist analysis. So you can imagine they put Cedric on the right, they put someone like Cornel West in the middle, and they put someone like Adolf Reed in the left.
Yeah.
And I feel like as much as I have, I don't agree with everything Adolf Reed says, and I
Mhm.
think sometimes he is actually class reductionist, I think his voice is so important. I think he challenges us so much to be on point in our analysis of what's actually happening. And I think he does like really spray bullets at the neoliberals kind of cannibalization of race politics
Mhm.
and even the black bourgeoisie.
Mhm.
I think domestically is on point, and I think internationally we can have those conversations.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
So now, carry on.
I was just going to say I agree.
Thank you. So, in the spirit of political education, recommend some authors and some books that you found really like instrumental in your journey.
No, yeah, absolutely. So I would probably recommend that people read Cedric Robinson's book, not because I think it's a great example of what a materialist analysis of the questions of Black oppression looks like, but because I think
Hmm.
a lot of us really put that book on a pedestal without actually interrogating some of the arguments that are in it. I think the best way for us to really critique the book and to really push past a lot of the arguments in it is by, again, sort of just interrogating it. So I would recommend people read Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. And to
Hmm.
sort of accompany that book, I would also sort of have to recommend this book by Frank Chapman called,
Amazing
yeah,
book.
amazing book, Marxist Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism, which includes a little deconstruction of Robinson's arguments within sort of,
I think in the introduction,
yeah,
isn't it?
in the
Or the first chapter
it's in the
introduction.
introduction. And so I think those are two books that really accompany each other. And I would also just recommend people check out, again, like other Black Marxists, because we do have that long tradition of people who have left writings for us that are really important to look at. So people like Claudia Jones, people like Henry Winston, people like Harry Haywood, all of these people within this sort of like Black Marxist Leninist tradition are people that we really need to make sure that we're looking towards, because they were concerned with what it means to apply a materialist analysis to questions of racial oppression and questions of Black
Hmm.
liberation.
Thank you so much, Aaron. This has been an amazing episode. I'm gonna have to get it so I got it on recording. You're gonna come back on again in the future.
Of course, of course. Just let me know when.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I'm going to put Aaron's socials in the comments on the description of the episode. Please like, comment, subscribe, hit him up. As you can tell, I've learned so much and I hope you did too. This is Mamadou on the Malcolm Effect, and peace out.